Hello, everyone. Last time when we looked at the dream in Daniel 2, that statue that King Nebuchadnezzar saw, we identified that dream, that statue, showed us successive major world kingdoms or empires that existed before our time, that was predicted way, way before, over 2,000 years ago, very accurately. And the next thing that the dream predicted would happen that we read in Daniel 2 was the setting up of God's kingdom. And we'll look a lot more at what exactly that kingdom is, what is God's kingdom. But and I believe that you will see also later, that that is a very, very good thing, the setting up of God's kingdom. It's not just a end of the world, end of humanity type of scenario. We looked at that, but the question then begs is, okay, well, how soon then would this God's kingdom happen, or this good thing that we can look forward to in the future? How soon would that happen? Are there any indicators that we can see besides only what's in Daniel chapter 2 that we looked at last time? So that's what I want to look at today. And you may have already heard people talk about this. There's a term, signs of the times. So we're going to look at Matthew chapter 24. So this is a gospel book in the New Testament in the Bible, the Gospel of Matthew. And I'm just going to start reading right off from verse 1. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" It's very interesting. So Jesus and his disciples, they're sort of walking around the grand Jewish temple, Hebrew temple that's there in Jerusalem. And the disciples, they want to show Jesus how magnificent this temple was. And as I understand what I've read in history, this really was a very magnificent structure. And for example, when the sun was setting or rising, and the sun radiated against the walls of the temple, was just very beautiful scene. And it was just a beautiful structure to behold. And so Jesus says, "Hey, don't you know that not even one stone will be left upon another?" We know in history that in AD 70, that the Romans, the Roman Empire, actually completely destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. And I believe that's what Jesus was referring to. But notice when Jesus says that, like, okay, this temple will unfortunately be destroyed, the disciples, they respond very interestingly. They say, "Tell us, when will these things be?" Okay, so the destruction of the temple. "And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So the disciples, they connect the destruction of the Jewish temple with two things. One, the sign of your coming, referring to the return of Jesus. And number two, the end of the age, or some Bible versions say the end of the world. So to them, the destruction of the temple meant this end-all scenario. And one important connection that we see here is this connection of the end of the world with the return of Jesus. That's an event that we will dig a lot more into in a later conversation. But just to keep that in the back of your mind, that they are connecting the return of Jesus with this end of the age scenario. And Jesus, in wisdom, what he does is he addresses both what it will be like just before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and what it will be like before his return, or this end of the age that we're talking about. And obviously, when this temple was destroyed in AD 70, it wasn't the end. It wasn't when Jesus returned. But Jesus, he takes indicators from both events and uses those similar in that have similarities and shares those with them so that both they could understand what it would be like before the destruction of the temple, and so we could understand before his return, or the end of the age, or the setting up of God's kingdom, like we read in Daniel chapter 2. Let's look at this. Verse 4, Matthew chapter 24, that we're reading, verse 4. And Jesus answered and said to them, Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Wow, those are some heavy things that Jesus just listed. And let me ask you this question. Do any of these things that Jesus just listed sound familiar to you as to something you may have seen or see today in our world? I think that's for sure, and something that I feel like we see a lot or have seen, and that a lot of people would probably agree with. Now, someone might say, okay, we've already seen earthquakes. This world has already seen wars for thousands of years. There's been diseases. There's been people claiming to be Jesus. Those things have already happened. And surely, just as Jesus meant to explain some of these signs before the destruction of the temple, these things have already happened. But notice what Jesus says in verse 8, the end of what we just read. All these things are the beginning of sorrows. That word sorrows in the Greek, the original language that this was written in, is the word for birth pains. Birth pains. If you know anything about birth pains, or maybe you experienced it yourself, or you know someone who has, whether it be a wife, mother, or friend, or whatnot, it's talking about a contractions that a woman experiences before she gives birth to a child. And in the beginning, when she begins to experience those contractions, they're sort of far and few in between. But as it becomes closer to the delivery of the baby, those contractions, they start to increase in frequency. They're happening more often. They're happening closer and closer together in time. And not only are they happening more often, the closer it gets to the delivery time, but they are increasing in their intensity. They're becoming stronger, the contractions. So they're both increasing in frequency and intensity. And this is what Jesus is using as a analogy for how these things that he's describing that are predicted to happen would be. So we've seen these things happening, but Jesus is saying all of this, earthquakes, call it weather things, disease, war, people claiming to be him, are going to happen more frequently and with a higher intensity than before. So we can ask ourselves, have some of these things begun to happen more often and begun to happen at a more stronger scale? We can go into many of the, for example, seismological studies of the earthquakes, and there's charts that will show you how in even just the last 100 years how much more intense and how much more frequent we've had earthquakes. And it seems like you really hear about that a lot in the news nowadays with earthquakes and even tsunamis, um, and or with wars. When you think about war, for many years, for thousands of years, war was sort of this bow and arrow type of a event. Whereas nowadays, you compare it to nowadays, what is war like? Not only do we have um, very um, deadly weapons that we use, but we have nuclear bombs that we have enough nuclear bombs that we really could wipe out the world if enough of them were to go off at the same time. And many of those bombs could easily wipe out an entire major city of the world. And we didn't have that before. And we definitely do hear a lot and know of wars happening right now. Some of us that are very close to us, very close to our heart. And there's this talk about, oh, are we going to enter into a third world war soon? Is there going to be a nuclear war soon? So there's definitely not only wars that we see happening, but rumors of wars, and I believe at a increase of frequency and definitely increase of intensity in the type of wars, how they're fought, how many people die, and unfortunately, we see that in our world. I want to turn really briefly to the Gospel Luke. So Matthew, Mark, and the Gospel Luke, and verse 21. In chapter 21. So in Luke 21, it's sort of a parallel account of when Jesus is explaining these signs to the disciples. And it's a little bit shorter than Matthew's, but I just want to read something out of Luke's account. So Luke 21, verse 25. And there will be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars, and on the earth distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them from fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. So Luke, he gets a little bit more into these physical, natural phenomena that are, Jesus says, are expected to happen before his second coming. Not only earthquakes, but other natural phenomena, or call it natural disasters, are those things that seem to happen a lot nowadays. Let's go back to Matthew 24. Matthew 24, and I'm going to read verse 12. It says, and because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. So it's a very interesting one. The love of many will grow cold. Another question we can ask is, does it seem like many people, their love has grown cold and there's this hatred for one another that's become more frequent? Of course, there's still many awesome, loving people in this world, and all these signs that we're talking about, it's not meant to simply be a doom and gloom type of a revelation, but to say, okay, these things Jesus said would occur. Well, do we see so many of these things happening today? And if we do, what does that tell us? How close are we to this setting up of God's kingdom? Are we very close if we see these things happening more frequently and at a higher intensity? I want to revert back one more time to Luke 21. And Luke 21 and verse 28. I really like this verse. It says, now when these things begin to happen, look up and lift up your heads, because your redemption draws near. So Jesus says, okay, these are some bad things that I'm talking about that will happen. But he says, be encouraged. Why? Lift up your heads, because your redemption draws near. Very interesting. What does that mean, your redemption draws near? That's a very, very good question. I think that we will look at in our next conversations a lot more. And what is that redemption? Well, it's tied to the last sign that Jesus explains in Matthew 24. The last sign here in Matthew 24. Chapter 24, verse 14. Verse 14 says, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come." So, what does Jesus say will be the last sign before the end comes? This preaching of the gospel of the kingdom. That word gospel, comes from another Greek word. It literally means good news. So there's going to be a good news that is spread across the whole world. And then the end will come. Wow, what is that good news? And I am so excited to talk about that. And we're gonna spend a whole conversation just on that good news, and it has to do entirely about this person Jesus and what he did for us, and I'm super excited to talk about that. But this redemption he's talking about that we can look forward to, this good news that will be spread, we have a positive hope for the future. And Jesus, he wants us to know what that hope is. He wants us to know what this good news is. And my question, my appeal is, even first of all, do we recognize that we see some of these signs that Jesus is talking about? And if so, what does that indicate about how close we may be to the setting up of God's kingdom? And the second question would be is, do we want to learn about what this good news is? I'll end it here with a prayer. God, thank you for what you've chosen to reveal to us. Thank you for helping us to better understand where we are in our lives in this earth's history, for helping us to be prepared for whatever the future holds. And thank you that we can have a confident hope in a positive and a good future, and we can keep our heads high. Help us to learn more about this redemption and this good news that you have for us, and to learn more about who you are and what you have planned for us in our lives. Be with all of us now who hear this, and as we continue to learn more. I pray this and thank you in your name. Amen. See you all in the next one. Hope you have a great rest of your day, rest of your evening, and I'll see you then.